Imagine designing a multi-million-dollar technological marvel. I mean, a fully immersive, augmented reality reconstruction of a cursed abandoned city. You map the history, you render this incredibly eco-friendly future, and you package it into a platform that could, single-handedly reboot a region's entire tourism economy.
Right, a massive undertaking.
Massive. And then you offer it to the government completely for free. You don't ask for a single cent. You just want their official stamp of approval to launch the thing. And their response, absolute deafening silence for 2 straight years.
Oh man, just nothing.
Nothing. Your emails just disappear into this bureaucratic black hole. Now, most rational human beings would, they'd pack up their laptops, update their resumes, and go find a stable corporate job with a dental plan.
Yeah, of course. You'd be crazy not to.
But the person who built that AR project didn't quit. In fact, that wall of silence somehow forced them to dig even deeper into the venture. And that irrational, almost pathological resilience is the fundamental mystery we are tearing apart today.
It completely defies standard economic logic. And that's why we're looking at this fascinating 2025 exploratory study from Manisa Bayar University in Turkey. It's called To Start or Not to Start, an exploratory study of work meaningfulness among startup co-founders.
Such a great paper.
It really is. The researchers, Deniz Direk and Barakas Dozan, they bypassed all the usual metrics. They didn't ask founders about their burn rate or their customer acquisition cost or their total addressable market.
Right. None of the standard VC spreadsheet stuff.
Exactly. They conducted these intense qualitative interviews with 12 diverse startup co-founders. They were trying to figure out the psychological unit economics of building a company. Like, how do you actually manufacture enough internal meaning to survive a reality where the market, the investors, and sometimes even your own government seem actively hostile to your existence?
And this brings us to the real hook for today's deep dive. We spend billions of dollars in the venture capital ecosystem trying to predict which companies will achieve a 100x return, right? We obsess over product market fit and tech defensibility, but we entirely ignore the human engine sitting at the center of the machine.
We really do. We just assume the founder will somehow endure it.
Yeah, and the premise here is that in the absence of a corporate structure, which, historically spoon feeds you your purpose, a founder has to actively construct meaning from absolute scratch.
From nothing.
Right. So if you are listening to this and you are an ambitious founder trying to build a generational company, or maybe a forward-thinking VC trying to understand why your portfolio founders are burning out, or even just a builder moving from concept to market disruption, understanding the mechanics of how these 12 individuals synthesize meaning, it is going to completely rewire your entire approach to company building.
I completely agree. We are essentially bridging the gap between deep industry innovation like cutting-edge tech and sustainability and elite venture execution. Because the baseline reality of this ecosystem is so often masked by, the glamour of tech media.
Oh, absolutely. The magazine covers.
Right, the unicorn valuations, the effortless TED Talks.
Yeah.
We don't see the psychological void underneath it all. The researchers actually ground their study in this brutal observation from Sam Altman. He pointed out that running a startup isn't like being a student where you can just, accept a bad grade when you're exhausted.
Yeah, you can't just sleep in.
No, it is real life. And it just sucks sometimes, and you just have to get through it. There is no professor to grant an extension. When you leave traditional employment, you step into what organizational psychologists actually call a meaning crisis.
A meaning crisis. The contrast is just stark. I like to think of it like, let's look at the traditional corporate track. It functions like this massive luxury passenger ship.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. You walk on board, the destination is already charted, the captain is steering, the buffet opens at noon, and your specific job is just to, keep the brass polished on deck 4.
Just polish the brass.
Yeah. And if the ship hits a storm, it's terrifying, but it's the captain's problem. You still get your paycheck. You still have your job title. The organization provides the structure, the boundaries, and the mission statement. Leaving that to build a startup is essentially jumping off the ship in the middle of the Atlantic to build your own raft out of driftwood.
And that raft offers complete freedom, sure, but it demands an exhausting psychological toll. On the passenger ship, your manager derives the meaning for you. Your tasks are defined by legacy systems. But on the raft, you are surrounded by extreme uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Total chaos. Every morning you wake up, you don't just have to paddle. You have to literally convince yourself that paddling in this specific direction is the most existentially significant thing you could possibly be doing. If you fail to generate that meaning, The physical and mental fatigue will quite literally drown you.
Wow. And that distinction between the type of meaning and the volume of it is where the researchers draw a really fascinating line, I think. They separate the meaning of work from work meaningfulness, which, on the surface, those sound totally identical.
You do, but the nuance is critical for anyone trying to optimize their own performance. So the meaning of work is qualitative. It's the category or the label.
Like how you categorize your job.
Exactly. Do you view your work as a means to buy groceries? Do you view it as a creative outlet, a social duty? That's the flavor of the work. Work meaningfulness, however, is quantitative. It is the absolute density or amount of significance you attach to the job.
The volume.
Right. It is the subjective measurement of how deeply existentially valuable you find the daily grind to be. So the study isn't just looking at what flavor of meaning founders choose, it's decoding how they generate such a massive, unyielding quantity of it.
And to measure that density, the researchers deploy two pretty heavy-hitting psychological frameworks. The first one is self-determination theory, or SDT. This goes all the way back to Dessing and Ryan in the 80s, and it strips human motivation down to three bare biological and psychological needs.
Autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Exactly.
And SDT posits that these aren't just, nice-to-have preferences. They are innate requirements for human flourishing, much like water or sleep.
So if you don't have them, you psychologically starve.
Essentially, yes. Autonomy is the sensation that your actions are self-endorsed. You are the author of your own destiny, acting in alignment with your core values rather than being coerced by external pressures or micromanagement.
Right.
Confidence is the mastery over your environment. It's that deep satisfaction of solving a complex problem or executing a difficult skill. And relatedness is the universal desire to interact, be connected to, and experience caring for others. When a workplace starves an employee of these three nutrients, you see burnout, cynicism, high turnover.
So the traditional corporate passengership might give you competence, like you get really good at polishing that brass, right? And it gives you relatedness through your coworkers, but it systematically strips you of autonomy. You just can't change the course of the ship.
Which brings in the second framework, the Job Characteristics Model, or JCM, developed by Hackman and Oldham. While SDT looks at human needs, JCM looks at the mechanical design of the job itself.
The actual structure of the work.
Yeah, it maps out 5 dimensions that trigger internal motivation: skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback.
Task identity seems particularly weaponized in a startup environment, doesn't it? I mean, if you work in a legacy automaker, you might spend 5 years optimizing the hinge on a car door.
Right.
Your task identity is practically zero. You never see the whole car being built. You never sell the car. You never talk to the driver. But a startup founder, they design the software, write the code, design the logo, pitch the VC, handle the customer support, and balance the books. The task identity encompasses the entire life cycle of the universe they created.
The psychological loop is entirely closed. When a founder sees a piece of work through from absolute zero to commercial deployment, the cognitive reward is just immense. You pair that with task significance, the genuine belief that the product is actually improving human lives, and you create a highly combustible, motivational fuel.
That's like rocket fuel for the brain.
Exactly. But the study adds a vital filter here. They differentiate between necessity entrepreneurs and opportunity entrepreneurs. The 12 founders interviewed fall firmly into the latter category, and that changes the entire math of their meaning.
Okay, let's break that down. So a necessity entrepreneur is someone pushed onto the raft because the passenger ship literally sank, or maybe the passenger ship never even docked in their country, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They start a business because formal employment just isn't available, or they were laid off. The immediate driver is pure survival, putting food on the table.
Opportunity entrepreneurs, conversely, are pulled toward the raft. They often have lucrative, stable corporate jobs, but they voluntarily abandon them because they are driven by a growth mindset and a desire for independence.
They want the challenge.
Right. And because their basic survival needs are relatively secure, they have the psychological bandwidth to look beyond mere self-gratification. The research indicates that opportunity entrepreneurs are structurally primed to consider the well-being of society, their employees, and the environment. They are searching for a transcendent, virtuous iteration of capitalism.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the actual findings of the study. The researchers mapped the interviews into this tripartite model, 3 distinct dimensions of meaning that founders construct. The first is the professional dimension. This is the bedrock, really. It's how they define significance and autonomy in the daily execution of the business.
And When we examine significance within this professional dimension, the interviews reveal a startling spectrum. We naturally default to assuming that significance must mean philanthropy or saving the world. But for several founders, significance is ruthlessly pragmatic. Participant F11, who operates a cybersecurity startup, exemplifies this perfectly.
Oh, F11.
Mm.
His honesty is incredibly refreshing because he just cuts right through the typical Silicon Valley PR speak.
He really does.
He basically says, look, we can talk about changing the world all day, but the underlying physics of a startup are binary. You identify a pain point, you engineer a solution, you distribute it, and you generate revenue. He stated explicitly that his primary motivation is the eventual exit.
Mm.
He views the startup as an asset to be built and sold. If the financial success isn't there, the motivation just evaporates.
And that perspective is easily criticized as mercenary, right? But from a psychological standpoint, it is a highly effective meaning generator. Establishing a vehicle for self-perpetuation and financial sovereignty is a massive driver of competence and autonomy. F11 frames his daily grind not as a transcendent mission, but as a complex game he intends to win.
Yeah, he wants to beat the game.
Exactly. The significance is derived from the sheer difficulty of the execution.
But then you look at participant F7, and the contrast is just jarring. F7 co-founded an energy benchmarking company, and her metrics for success operate on a planetary scale. She doesn't just track revenue, she tracks carbon.
Right.
She noted that their software had reduced carbon emissions by 220,000 tons, which she equated to planting 10 million trees, while simultaneously saving her clients $35 million.
The psychological anchor for F7 is legacy. She articulated a profound awareness of mortality, stating that since we all have limited time on Earth, she wants to ensure she leaves a measurable difference between the time she arrived and the time she departs.
It's beautiful, really.
Yeah, it is. The $35 million in corporate savings is just the commercial Trojan horse that allows her to plant the metaphorical 10 million trees. Her work meaningfulness is entirely tethered to environmental altruism.
And pushing the spectrum even further, we have participant F4, the founder working in virtual and augmented reality. F4's motivation borders on the philosophical. I mean, he isn't just trying to save the planet, he is trying to force the evolutionary next step of the human species.
Yeah, his vision is wild.
Right. He believes that the only true distinction between humans and animals is our capacity for creation. His stated goal is to use AI and technology to entirely eradicate repetitive, mundane labor, thereby forcing humanity to transition exclusively into creative and artistic professions.
It is a totally utopian vision, and yet it serves the exact same psychological function as F11's desire for lucrative exit. Whether the goal is a massive buyout, neutralizing carbon, or automating human drudgery, the function of significance is to create a North Star. It acts as a cognitive shield against existential dread.
Because when you are working 18-hour days facing payroll shortages and server crashes.
Exactly. A deeply held belief in the significance of the end goal is the only thing that prevents the brain from categorizing the suffering as pointless.
But having a North Star doesn't matter if you aren't the one steering the ship, does it? Which brings us to the second half of the professional dimension, autonomy. In the SDT framework, we established autonomy as the need for control. But the reality of a startup is that you are beholden to venture capitalists, market fluctuations, cash flow constraints. Total, absolute freedom is just a myth.
It is. And the study redefines autonomy in the startup context not as the absence of constraints, but as perceived independence and the velocity of decision-making. It's the ability to perceive a market shift at 9:00 a.m. and pivot the company's entire strategy by noon without having to route a memo through 4 layers of middle management for approval.
But I have to challenge the practical application of this, though. If a founder left the corporate world specifically because they chafe under authority and demand total autonomy, doesn't that inherently make them a bottleneck?
How do you mean?
Well, if the founder insists on total control, the business can only scale as far as their personal bandwidth allows. They essentially build a new passenger ship where they're the tyrannical captain, which seems to contradict the freedom they were seeking in the first place.
That is the classic founder's trap. The desire for autonomy often mutates into micromanagement, which ultimately destroys the company. But the high-functioning founders in this study deployed a really counterintuitive strategy. They achieved personal autonomy through extreme delegation and radical transparency. They realized that holding all the power actually enslaved them to the business.
So giving up control gave them freedom.
Exactly. Participant F2 is the perfect case study for this. He runs an AI startup with a team of around 15 people. Instead of hoarding the decision-making power, he actively distributes it. He described this incredible moment of validation when a team member looked at him, the founder and CEO, and said, "This is my area. You may have started the company, but I am the expert here and I will dictate the direction of this specific project."
Wow, and most founders would hate that.
A weaker founder would perceive that as insubordination or a huge threat to their ego. F2 perceived it as the ultimate triumph. By relinquishing control over the micro decisions, he protected his macro autonomy. He built a system that operates independently of his constant input, allowing the venture to react to societal or market changes instantaneously. Autonomy, for F2, isn't about making every decision. It's about having the power to choose which decisions he doesn't have to make.
But that requires an infrastructural level of trust. You are no longer hiring employees to follow a checklist. You are hiring sovereign operators.
And you can only cultivate sovereign operators through radical transparency. Participant F5, a co-founder in the renewable energy sector, dismantles the traditional hierarchy by sharing everything with her team. She exposes the revenue data, the burn rate, the debt burden, everything. The traditional corporate mindset assumes that sharing financial stress with employees will cause panic.
Oh.
F5 found that transparency actually liberated her. She didn't have to bear the psychological weight of secrecy. By treating her team as true partners in the reality of the business, she fostered an environment where autonomy was distributed safely.
And that distributed autonomy leads to a phenomenon the study calls moral licensing, which is simultaneously hilarious and profoundly important. Participant F3, who works in clean energy production, gave this deeply relatable anecdote. He woke up one morning, took a shower, got dressed for the office, and suddenly experienced a wave of absolute exhaustion.
We've all been there.
Right. He just thought, I cannot do this today. So he picked up his phone, called his co-founders and team, and simply said, I'm not coming in. No fake sick day, no elaborate excuse, just I'm out for the day.
And because of the trust and transparency they had built, his partners just said, okay, we've got it. F3 noted that if he had tried to hoard all the autonomy as a solo founder, taking that day off would have paralyzed the company and flooded him with immense guilt.
So moral licensing functions as a psychological pressure valve. The traditional corporate structure doesn't tolerate an employee saying, I just don't have the mental capacity today, without a doctor's note. The autonomy these founders built isn't just the freedom to work on what they want. It is the vital freedom to occasionally choose not to work, secure in the knowledge that the ecosystem they design will not collapse in their absence.
Right. And actually, before we move on, this directly connects to that founder's checklist we promised.
Oh, yes. Yeah, actionable frameworks.
Because if you are a founder listening to this, you need to be asking yourself these hard questions about your own professional meaningfulness. First, product market fit and tech defensibility. Are you building an AI to eliminate jobs like F4 or a pragmatic cybersecurity tool like F11? Does your technical moat justify the psychological toll you are paying?
That's a great question.
Second, value capture analysis and unit economics.
Mm.
Are your margins strong enough to allow you to delegate like F2 did? If your unit economics are broken, you can't afford to hire sovereign operators, which means you can never buy back your autonomy.
You're just trapping yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And third, scaling operations from R&D to commercial reality. Does your culture have the radical transparency of F5 so that when you transition from a scrappy R&D phase to full commercial reality, the team operates without you micromanaging every single contract?
Man, those are piercing questions, and it's a perfect segue into the second pillar of the tripartite model, the psychological dimension. Because while the professional dimension covers the external execution of the business, the psychological dimension deals with the internal, visceral reality of the founder's mind. And the first major finding here is what we can classify as an identity blur.
Identity blur, yeah.
In a standard career, there is a firewall between the self and the profession. You are an accountant from 9 to 5, but at 5:01 p.m., you are a father, a musician, a friend. The job is an activity you perform, not the entirety of your being. But for these founders, that firewall completely disintegrates. The startup ceases to be an external entity and becomes a literal appendage of their ego.
The level of enmeshment is staggering. It operates almost like a psychological autoimmune condition, where the founder's brain can no longer distinguish between the self and the external company. Participant F1, who operates in the biomedical equipment space, articulated this with terrifying clarity. She described the startup as a mother-daughter venture, noting that the company perfectly mirrored her own personal brand value and her innate risk-taking character.
The quote that literally stopped me in my tracks was when F1 said, "If this business does not work out, I feel like I will not exist either."
Yeah, let the weight of that statement settle. I will not exist either.
It's intense.
If a corporate employee gets laid off, they lose their income and perhaps their professional confidence. If F1's startup fails, she experiences ego death. The company is not a project. It is her avatar in the physical world. If the market rejects the product, her brain interprets it as the market rejecting her fundamental right to exist.
But that sounds like a catastrophic vulnerability. I mean, why would anyone willingly wire their psychology to be that fragile? If your entire sense of self is tied to a venture with a, 90% statistical probability of failure, you are walking through a minefield blindfolded.
Because the inverse is also true. When the identity is that enmeshed, every minor success, every closed deal, every line of functional code delivers a hit of existential validation that a corporate employee will simply never experience. It is the highest stakes game imaginable.
Though it's worth noting that not every founder allows the enmeshment to go that deep. F11, our pragmatic cybersecurity founder who just wants the exit, he actively fights against that identity blur. He explicitly stated, "I've never been the kind of person who thinks, this job is my baby, my life." He conceptualizes the startup as a field battle. He is a player on the pitch, executing plays to win the championship. Once the game is won, he plans to retire to the stands and adopt a completely new identity.
But even F11's defense mechanism proves the point. He has to actively conceptualize a battle to keep his identities separate. And whether you view the startup as your literal child or as a brutal combat zone, the daily reality forces you into what the researchers describe as the crucible of challenge and resilience. This is where the study gets uncomfortably raw.
Uncomfortably raw is right. This brings us back to the story I mentioned at the very beginning, participant F4 and the Cypress Verotia AR project. I want to dissect the mechanics of that kind of institutional friction. F4 builds a multi-million-dollar technological gift, offers it to the state for free to boost the economy, and is met with a 2-year wall of silence from the presidency and municipalities. In a rational world, you walk away. Why didn't he?
Because of the psychological sunk cost fallacy intertwined with the need for competence. When a founder encounters a roadblock that absurd, their brain doesn't process it as a signal to stop. It processes it as a puzzle to solve. The bureaucratic incompetence of the government becomes the dragon that must be slain to prove the founder's ultimate capability.
It's the Sisyphus analogy brought up by participant F9. F9 runs a digital marketing startup, and he compared the entire founder experience to the Greek myth of King Sisyphus. You know, the guy cursed by the gods to push a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down to the bottom the moment he reached the peak for all eternity.
It's a perfect analogy. F9 detailed the grueling process of securing venture capital, the endless pitch decks, the due diligence, the legal structuring. It is a monumental physical and mental exertion. Finally, the term sheet is signed. The money hits the bank account. The boulder is at the top of the mountain. They pop the champagne.
And the very next morning, they realize the money isn't the finish line, it's the starting gun. The investors now expect a 10x return on that capital. The boulder instantly rolls back down to the bottom, heavier than before, and the founder has to start pushing again. F9 described it as a never-ending sense of not being fully satisfied.
And that dissatisfaction is compounded by the behavior of the ecosystem itself. F9 exposed a deeply toxic element of the venture capital world: investor ghosting.
Oh, this part is infuriating.
Founders are often required to strip their companies bare during pitches. They hand over their proprietary data, their financial vulnerabilities, their strategic roadmaps. They are told by the VC partners that the metrics look great and contracts are being drafted.
And then nothing. Total silence.
Right. F9 realized that some of these venture capital associates were just taking meetings to hit internal firm quotas for the quarter. They had absolutely zero intention of deploying capital.
That is just brutal.
F9 called it a disconnect that doesn't fit human nature. It's an extraction of the founder's time, energy, and hope, purely for the administrative convenience of the investor.
And this touches on the fourth question from our founder's checklist: navigating the investor landscape and pitching VCs. If you are going out to raise, you have to mentally prepare for the fact that a yes isn't a yes until the wire hits the bank, and the ghosting is a reflection of the VC's structural flaws, not your business model.
Exactly. The emotional whiplash of being promised capital and then being ignored is devastating. It attacks the relatedness and competence pillars of SDT simultaneously. You feel isolated, and you question your own ability to read human intentions.
The physical toll of this psychological crucible is alarming. Participant F7, the founder focused on carbon reduction, admitted that the stress became so acute that she started experiencing visual hallucinations.
Yeah, that part of the paper was wild.
She said a physical light began appearing in her vision, and medical professionals confirmed it was a purely psychosomatic manifestation of the immense pressure she was carrying.
Which forces the central question. If the process is causing you to hallucinate, if investors are treating you like a disposable data point, if the government is ignoring your free innovations, and if every victory just resets the boulder at the bottom of the hill, why do they continue?
Because the friction is the feature.
Precisely. We assume that meaning is found in the absence of struggle, in the peaceful resolution of problems. But for these founders, the meaning is forged inside the struggle. Returning to the job characteristics model, task significance requires challenge. If building a company were easy, everyone would do it, and the achievement would carry zero psychological weight.
It's the marathon runner's paradox. At mile 20, the body is screaming in agony, the glycogen is depleted, and the brain is begging them to stop. But the pain isn't a malfunction. It is the required currency to purchase the feeling of crossing the finish line. If you skip the 20 miles and just step across the line, you feel nothing. Participant F1 summarized this evolution by saying, "We have gotten used to it as part of our character. We've become people who motivate ourselves." The constant trauma of the startup environment forces the founder to build an internal motivation engine so powerful it alters their fundamental personality.
They become anti-fragile. The shocks and volatility don't break them, they make them structurally stronger. But building and running that internal engine requires massive amounts of fuel, which leads to the complete obliteration of the traditional concept of work-life balance.
The researchers are unequivocal on this point. For founders, work-life balance is a complete myth. The scale is permanently heavily tilted toward the venture. Participant F6 was brutally pragmatic about it, stating that a third life, meaning time for hobbies, sports, or idle socializing, simply does not exist because 24 hours in a day is fundamentally insufficient.
The corporate world obsesses over establishing firm boundaries between the office and the home to protect mental health. But founders view those boundaries as artificial limitations. Participant F7 offered a brilliant reframe. She said, "There's no such thing as work-life balance. I believe in work-life harmony."
That semantic shift is huge. Balance implies a zero-sum game. If work gets heavier, life gets lighter, and the scale tips into dysfunction. Harmony implies an orchestra. The work might be the loudest instrument, the driving percussion, while personal life is a subtle string section in the background. As long as they're playing the same underlying chord, the founder doesn't experience cognitive dissonance.
And participant F5 gave a perfect example of this harmony. She actively dissolved the boundary between her social life and her operational duties. When her friends wanted to go out, she would invite them to the startup's office.
I love that.
Right. She'd bring out wine, socialize with her friend group, and simultaneously monitor her business operations and respond to emails. To a corporate HR department, that looks like a tragic inability to disconnect. To F5, it is the seamless integration of her entire existence. The lack of boundaries isn't an imposition. It is a choice enabled by her autonomy.
So we have the professional dimension, the significance, and the autonomy to steer the raft. We have the psychological dimension, the enmeshed identity, and the anti-fragile resilience forged in the crucible. But a closed psychological loop eventually runs out of oxygen. You can't just motivate yourself in a dark room indefinitely. You need an external mirror to reflect the value of your suffering back to you.
This introduces the third and final pillar of the tripartite model, social meaningfulness. If we look back at self-determination theory, this is the relatedness component operating at maximum capacity. It encompasses the recognition, validation, and support derived from the external world.
For a founder trapped in the Sisyphus cycle, constructive feedback isn't just a nice performance review. It is literal psychological oxygen. It validates that the hallucination-inducing stress is actually tethered to objective reality.
Participant F8 provided one of the most triumphant examples of this dynamic. He operates a hospitality software startup that developed an AI model for digital menus. Instead of just displaying food, the AI analyzes historical data, weather patterns, and customer demographics to dynamically advise restaurant owners on how to adjust pricing and highlight specific items to maximize margin.
The theoretical pitch is great, but the social validation came after deployment, right?
Exactly. The AI predicted a 30% increase in revenue for a specific client, But when the client called F8 back to report the actual data, they revealed that their sales hadn't just increased by 30%, they had tripled.
Tripled. Oh man, the unit economics on that tool must be insane.
Oh, absolutely. And F8 described the immediate aftermath in his office as a celebratory atmosphere. He stated that the excitement made him incredibly happy. Let's break down the mechanics of that happiness. It
Okay.
wasn't just about the software working, and it wasn't just about the recurring revenue.
That was bigger than that.
It was the undeniable social proof that his years of anxiety, coding, and pitching had fundamentally altered another human being's livelihood for the better. The restaurant owner can now pay their staff more, expand their business, and sleep easier, entirely because of the tool F8 built.
That external feedback instantly refills the internal tank of meaning. Participant F7 experienced a similar massive injection of social meaningfulness. She pitched her energy benchmarking software to a colossal, highly respected bank in Germany. After a grueling process, they bought it. Her reaction wasn't about the size of the contract. It was about the identity validation. She said, "Turkish engineers selling technology to German engineers, that was something very meaningful to me."
Germany is globally recognized for its rigorous, uncompromising engineering standards. For a Turkish startup to pass that threshold and be validated by that specific cohort, it transcends business. It is a profound nod of respect. F7 explicitly stated that this single interaction provided enough psychological fuel to keep me going for 2 years.
2 years of stamina from one successful closed deal. That proves that social meaningfulness acts as a hydraulic shock absorber for the entire psychological system. When the road gets bumpy with investor rejections or bureaucratic red tape, a massive surge of social validation smooths out the ride.
But the truly elite founders don't just wait passively for clients to validate them. The study highlights how these opportunity entrepreneurs actively engineer social meaningfulness through social responsibility initiatives. They embed philanthropy directly into their operational models to ensure a steady drip of relatedness.
Participant F10's story is the absolute pinnacle of this. She runs a consultancy firm, and she happened to hear a story about a primary school teacher in the agricultural region of Antalya. This teacher asked her young students a simple question. If you could design a robot, what would you want it to do?
Such a great question for kids.
Right. And one little boy, whose father was a local farmer, said he wanted to design a robot to chase crows out of the field because he watched his father come home exhausted every day from dealing with them.
It is a profound, hyper-local application of technology through the unjaded eyes of a child.
F10 heard that story, and her brain immediately scaled it. She didn't just donate a few iPads to the school, she architected a nationwide movement across Strinky called The Robot in My Dream. She mobilized her network to ask teachers across the entire country to have their students design, draw, or build their dream robots out of Legos, and upload videos explaining how these robots would solve local problems.
The logistics of organizing that across a nation are complex, especially for a founder already running a demanding consultancy. But the psychological ROI is just off the charts.
They reached 3,000 children. Imagine the density of work meaningfulness F10 experienced. She catalyzed a movement that forced 3,000 kids to actively engage with technology, problem solving, and their own agency. The startup grind becomes infinitely more bearable when you know your influence is echoing through the minds of thousands of children.
We see the same mechanism deployed on a microeconomic scale by participant F2, the AI founder. Training AI models requires massive amounts of data labeling and processing, a highly tedious, repetitive task. F2 could easily have outsourced this to the cheapest available labor pool globally. Instead, he structured it as a crowdsourcing gig model specifically targeting university students in Istanbul.
Istanbul is an incredibly expensive city, and F2 distinctly remembered the financial anxiety of being a student there.
Exactly. He brought 2,000 university students onto the platform. He recounted interactions where a student would tell him, "I labeled data for your company for a few weeks, and I used the gig money to buy a new pair of headphones."
It is the perfect symbiotic transaction. The startup gets the critical data processing required to train their AI, the student gets financial agency and a pair of headphones, and the founder gets a massive, concentrated dose of social meaning.
If we zoom out and look at the modern digital economy, this reveals a structural shift. Integrating social impact into your business model is no longer just a corporate social responsibility PR stunt for the annual report. For a startup founder, it is a non-negotiable requirement for mental stamina.
Yeah.
The friction of the ecosystem demands a high-octane fuel that equity and revenue alone simply cannot provide. If you want to survive the marathon, you have to build social impact into your unit economics.
So we have dissected the three pillars: professional meaningfulness, the pragmatic execution, the significance of the goal, and the autonomy of decision making. Psychological meaningfulness, the dangerous enmeshment of identity, the anti fragile resilience forged in failure, and the harmony of an unbalanced life. And social meaningfulness, the vital oxygen of feedback, recognition, and actively engineered social impact. The genius of this study is how the researchers synthesize these disparate elements into a cohesive engine.
They present a visual tripartite model in the text, labeled Figure 1. Imagine a triangular flowchart. At the top apex, you have the internal state, psychological meaningfulness. On the bottom left, the operational execution, professional meaningfulness. And on the bottom right, the external validation, social meaningfulness.
The critical feature of this diagram isn't the boxes themselves, it's the arrows connecting them. They're all double-sided arrows indicating constant dynamic fluidity.
It functions like an interconnected hydraulic system. The dimensions constantly compensate for one another. If a macroeconomic crisis hits and your revenue plummets, stripping you of professional significance and autonomy, the system is designed to automatically pull pressure from the social and psychological nodes. The founder might lean heavily into peer support networks or focus intensely on a small social impact initiative to maintain their overall baseline of meaning until the market recovers.
It is a living, breathing mechanism of meaning generation. Now, I want to take a massive step back and view this entire engine through the lens of the specific cultural environment where the study took place, because the geography makes these findings infinitely more compelling. These 12 founders are operating in Turkey. To understand the gravity of that, the researchers utilized the Hofstede culture typology.
Right, Geert Hofstede. He was a Dutch social psychologist who developed a universally recognized framework for cross-cultural communication. He mapped how the values in the workplace are fundamentally dictated by the broader national culture. One of his 6 primary dimensions is uncertainty avoidance. This metric evaluates a society's tolerance for ambiguity, unexpected events, and unstructured situations.
So a low uncertainty avoidance score indicates a culture that embraces risk, disruption, and rapid change. Think Silicon Valley's ethos of move fast and break things.
Correct, but Turkey scores an incredibly high 85 out of 100 on the Uncertainty Avoidance Index. It is a culture that historically seeks to minimize anxiety through strict adherence to laws, rules, safety measures, and established hierarchies. There is a deep-seated societal preference for known quantities and institutional stability.
Which means that choosing to build a startup in Turkey isn't just a career pivot. It is an act of profound cultural rebellion. You aren't just fighting the market, you are swimming against the psychological current of your entire society.
The societal pressure to conform to safety is immense. Participant F3 explicitly detailed this. He noted that his own family constantly pressured him, saying, "Get a steady job already. Be like everyone else. Work as blue-collar or white-collar. Have a stable income." When your most intimate support network is actively trying to pull you back onto the passenger ship because they perceive your raft as a suicidal endeavor, the psychological isolation is magnified exponentially.
It begs the question, does that cultural resistance actually make their internal engine of meaning burn hotter? If you have to defend your existence not just to venture capitalists, but to your own parents at the dinner table, you are forced to articulate your significance with absolute conviction.
The resistance absolutely tempers the steel. They cannot rely on default societal validation, so their internal construction of meaning must be flawless. But this cultural friction leads to perhaps the most fascinating macro revelation cited in the paper. The researchers point to data from the MOW meaning of Work International Research Team, which conducted a massive comparative study across the digitalized world.
And what they found completely shatters the idea of geographical business cultures.
It really does. The data reveals that founders across the globe are increasingly homogeneous in how they experience and construct meaningfulness. An opportunity entrepreneur grinding in an incubator in Istanbul possesses a psychological profile that is almost identical to a founder in San Francisco, Berlin, or Tel Aviv. They share the same vocabulary of unit economics, the same addiction to autonomy, and the same enmeshed identity structures.
The Turkish founder is essentially a psychological alien to the corporate employee living next door to them in Istanbul, but they are a native sibling to a founder they have never met in Silicon Valley. The global startup ecosystem has evolved into its own distinct sovereign culture, superseding national borders.
Which is exactly why the insights drawn from these 12 individuals are universally applicable. The mechanics of the tripartite model are the physics of the founder mind regardless of the zip code.
Let's pivot to execution. We promised to deliver a masterclass framework. If I am listening to this and I am a venture capitalist deploying capital or I'm running an accelerator program, what is the actionable mandate here? Because it sounds like my standard operating procedure might be actively destroying the value of my portfolio.
If you are an investor, you must internalize a fundamental truth. You are not just funding a cap table and a product roadmap. You are funding a highly volatile psychological engine. The greatest threat you pose to your own investment is overmeddling. When VC demands a board seat and begins micromanaging operational decisions to optimize short-term metrics, they are structurally stripping the founder of their autonomy.
You are systematically dismantling the bottom left quadrant of their meaning triangle.
Exactly. And when you strip their professional autonomy, you puncture the raft. You remove the exact psychological trait, that obsessive need for sovereign control that allowed them to build the company you found so attractive in the first place. Investors must act as guardrails, not steering wheels. Furthermore, the study implicitly demands that VCs audit the psychological capital of their founders. Don't just ask about customer acquisition cost. Ask about their resilience tank. Actively facilitate their social meaningfulness by connecting them with peer mentor networks. If you starve the founder of meaning, the unit economics of the business will inevitably collapse.
And what if I am the founder? How do I integrate this tripartite model into my operations tomorrow morning?
You implement a diagnostic audit of your meaning. When you hit a wall of exhaustion, don't just sleep it off. Look at the flowchart. Which node is failing? Are you suffocating from a lack of autonomy because you haven't delegated enough? Are you experiencing an identity crisis because you've enmeshed too deeply with a failing product line? Or are you isolated and starved of social feedback?
Once you identify the leak, you can actively reroute the hydraulics. If an investor ghosts you, you don't process it as an indictment of your self-worth. You reframe it as a necessary friction event to build your psychological resilience. You recognize the stress hallucination not as a failure, but as proof of the crucible.
Most importantly, you proactively engineer the social node. Do not wait until you have $1 billion valuation and a family foundation to think about impact. Embed it into your core operations immediately. Find a way to let university students buy headphones today. Design a system that helps a local farmer today. That social validation isn't charity. It is the vital operational fuel required to keep your brain engaged in the fight.
We have mapped the hidden architecture of the entrepreneurial mind. The professional drive for significance and autonomy, the psychological crucible that fuses identity and resilience, and the external social validation that acts as the ultimate shock absorber. Building a startup is so clearly not just a mechanism for wealth generation, it is an orchestrated existential pursuit to manufacture a reality where your daily labor aligns flawlessly with your deepest psychological needs.
It is the ultimate act of self-authorship. You are writing the code for both the software and your own soul simultaneously.
But as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a completely different vector to consider. We've spent this entire time analyzing how founders construct meaning to survive the grueling reality of building the future. We treat this psychological crucible as a necessary, noble burden. But let's look at this through an evolutionary lens.
Where are you taking this?
Well, for hundreds of thousands of years, human meaning was hard-coded into our daily physical survival. You hunted, you built shelter, you fought off predators. The meaning was absolute, binary, and externally imposed by nature. Today, we live in a world of unprecedented physical safety and abundance. The passenger ship is secure.
And yet we see these opportunity entrepreneurs deliberately abandoning that safety to construct artificial environments of extreme stress, uncertainty, and potential ruin.
Exactly. What if the startup ecosystem isn't actually about building better software or optimizing supply chains? What if human beings are fundamentally incapable of thriving in peace? Ask yourself this. Are we merely utilizing the startup model to build the future, or have we subconsciously engineered the brutal, high-stakes crucible of venture capitalism simply because we are desperate to recreate the life-or-death struggle our brains were evolutionarily designed for? Are startups just the modern digital equivalent of hunting saber-toothed tigers, a manufactured trauma we endure just to feel alive?
That suggests the suffering isn't the byproduct of the business. The business is the excuse for the suffering.
Something to mull over the next time you look at your pitch deck. If you want to keep rewiring your approach to building a startup and exploring the hard questions that actually move the needle, hit subscribe. We will see you on the next deep dive.